Hello everyone and welcome to this latest edition of the Sales Still Human Masterclass series where the conversation is the value. My name is Vinit and this edition I'm going to be focusing on what makes a buyer act and why so many deals actually stall. For me, the reality is pretty simple. Most deals stall because the right conditions for a decision have never ever been created. And in today's session, I'm going to be focusing on highlighting the real forces that cause buyers either to move forward or to remain stuck and waiting for more information. So to kick off, I want to start by highlighting some of the common symptoms that sales professionals and teams often experience. Firstly, deals so many times look promising at the start in the initial conversation, but they just don't move forward. And what often happens is that you have lots and lots of great conversations, you fill your pipeline with those opportunities, but what happens is that those opportunities don't move through your pipeline quick enough, and it affects your forecasts. And it essentially makes it really difficult for you to understand what's going to come in and what isn't, what opportunities are going to close versus the ones that you need to qualify out of. Secondly, buyers often seem so engaged, but as soon as they receive the information that you promised them or they get the proposal that you asked for, they disengage. They go radio silent, and it just has a huge effect in terms of the amount of time that you spend as salespeople, as sales teams, as managers chasing those opportunities. And thirdly, I often see lots and lots of activity in terms of calls made, follow-up meetings, requests for a next step. But progress on a lot of these opportunities just isn't forthcoming. These three are the biggest symptoms I often see when salespeople are pursuing opportunities. And I often think the instinct is often to assume that actually there's something wrong on the buyer's side. The buyer's organization is perhaps bureaucratic. The buyer didn't know what they want, or the competition that we're up against is perhaps better placed to be able to service the buyer's needs than we are. All of these for me are excuses and the issue is perhaps a lot simpler in most of the cases. And that is the condition for a confident decision for the buyer to make were never ever really created. What I mean by that is, as the sales organization, we did what we thought was right, but we never really truly understood from the buyer's perspective what they were trying to do, what their objective was, where they were in their decision-making process and their buying journey. And to really understand the root cause of these issues, we actually need to understand what is it that really makes the buyer act. For me, buyers act when three, call it conditions or factors, converge. They come together. Firstly, the problem is acknowledged and it is prioritized across the organization. So it isn't just one person that is prioritizing this particular decision or this particular issue. It is collectively, as a whole, the business comes together and they realize that this is a problem that is worth prioritizing, and it impacts everyone across the business in some which way, shape or form. Secondly, the impact in terms of outcome is really clear. Buying organization has done their due diligence. They understand actually what is currently happening. They have a measure for how they're going to understand they have a metric, should we say, or a measure of success that tells them that actually by doing this, by implementing this service, this solution, or buying this product, this is the net gain, the net result that we are looking for. So they have a very clear idea of where they are today and where they want to get to. And thirdly, and probably this is the one that is for me the most important, but most sales organizations, most salespeople don't think about enough, and that is the organization is actually ready to change. The organization has made a conscious decision that they are willing to not only put the financial investment in that is required, but also the emotional investment that's needed from a change management perspective. Decisions often get prioritized when the impact and cost of maintaining the status quo becomes greater than the risk of that change. If that threshold is not reached, then opportunities are naturally going to slow down. Let me give you some examples. Now, I have had lots and lots of conversations with clients over the years where they understand the problem, they prioritize the problem, they have an idea of what the outcome that they're looking for is, but the appetite for change in the business just doesn't exist. A really good example of this that I can give is when I used to work in market research, I saw this financial services client. They were using the data that the organization I worked for, they were ingesting that data and using it for forecasting. Now, this was a new prospect and they already had an incumbent supplier. So I was going in trying to displace this incumbent supplier. And the conversations were fantastic. Across the business, I had multiple stakeholders engaged. They understood actually the benefit that they would actually get. Here's the challenge. The cost of change for them was too much. The disruption that it would cause in their business was too much. So whilst they loved what we had, they knew that it was better quality data. They knew they could see, they could visualize the results they could get. The cost of that change was enormous to their business because it would have meant that they would have to completely revamp and rework their internal practices. Now, in that particular case, the prospect went as far as saying to me that actually we know that the incumbent supplier, their forecasting model is out by roughly 5%. And our data would have corrected that. But what they also realized is actually rather than making this huge investment and the investment in terms of financial investment and emotional investment, they just decided to adjust how they interpreted the incumbent supplier's data. And they downgraded it by 5% every time, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that everything from a seller's perspective might seem really trivial. It might seem as though this is a no-brainer. And often the problem gets prioritized. Yes, the customer has an understanding of what that ideal outcome looks like. But if the emotional cost of that change hasn't been considered and they haven't bought into it, then the likelihood is that the buyer is never ever going to make that transition. Now, we're in a place today where there is lots of conversations going on around AI. There's lots of conversations perhaps going on around regulation, which is making organizations need to change. And these are all really good examples where actually problems are prioritized. The outcomes are validated. The key thing from a selling perspective that you have to understand is that emotional cost of change. How is your client, your buyer, going to make that transition? Because if they haven't thought that through, that's a big issue because it will naturally impact more than just a few people in the business. Any kind of change like this is going to have a huge knock-on detrimental impact in the client's business. So how do you know if your buyers are really serious? And how do you get to that stage where you know the problem's prioritized, you know the outcome is validated, and actually that change management piece is also considered? Well, for me, there are 3 phases or stages of buyer seriousness. And I like to refer to them as interest, intent, and commitment. Let me explain in a little bit more detail. Well, at the interest stage, what I like to describe is that the buyer, the client, the prospect, they are really curious. They are in exploring phase. And generally speaking, they may have actually asked for this meeting. And they will naturally attend the meetings because they're curious, because they're collecting information, they're researching. They're going to ask you lots and lots of questions. They're going to perhaps even request a demo. They might even ask you for more information. They might ask you for an early stage proposal, but they can't give you all of the information that you want to do that. Now, what happens here is that energy that the prospect brings to this stage, a lot of salespeople misinterpret that as progress, misinterpret that as the buyer urgency, meaning that they are really ready to buy right now. Actually, where the buyer tends to be at this point in time is in research or education mode, right? And the buyer is, in a sense, learning at this stage. Now, they realize, they have understood that there's something has to happen. But what they're doing is that perhaps a team has been put together in the buyer's organization to go out there and actually scan the market, go and figure out what options we have, go and understand the market, go and do all of that due diligence. That is this interest phase. And too often, too many salespeople actually mistake this as momentum. They mistake this as actually the buyer is ready to buy. They're asking so many questions. They're so engaged that they're ready to buy. Now, the second phase that I often see buyers go into is what I call intent. And Intent is where a number of the dots have been connected within the buyer's organization, and that problem is recognized internally and it's started to get the priority that it needs. There is an internal realization that something needs to be done because that cost of status quo, i.e. staying the same, just isn't good enough anymore. If they don't change, they know that they're going to be left behind. At this particular stage, they just haven't decided who they're going to do it with. And they don't actually know. They've got an idea of what to do, but they don't know exactly how they're going to do it. So they do, however, know an idea of what they want to achieve. Right? So they have an idea of that measure of success, and they have an idea of actually that problem being prioritized in their business. So the intent phase is where the level of seriousness now goes up. They're asking a different kind of question. They're engaging with you in a different way. And perhaps this is where they let the salesperson qualify more. And they have more of that information that you need from a qualification perspective. And finally, the third phase of buyer seriousness that I like to describe is called commitment. And commitment is really where the business has educated themselves. They have a compelling reason to act. They've evaluated the options in the market, and now they enter into a proactive conversation. They're ready to execute. They are ready to actually execute that decision-making process, that buying process from their side. This is the stage that really kicks off the sales process. It could be intent or it could be here, but these two stages are very closely intertwined. The key is that the buyer has now made a conscious decision that they're going to do this. And one of the litmus tests for me is that actually they recognize that change management piece. They recognize and they have committed to that emotional change element. This is crucial. And I think this is something that a lot of salespeople do not focus on. They do not talk about to their clients. Because if you understand that, I guess if buying organizations have thought through that transformation change management process, the ones that have are the ones that are actually more likely to go through with this particular decision process. So for me, what often happens is that salespeople treat the interest as opportunity, and then they fill their pipeline, the later stages of their pipeline, with lots and lots of opportunities that are actually at interest stage. They're not at intent or commitment stage, they are at interest stage. Now, remember, interest creates that conversation. Intent actually creates the opportunity, but it's commitment that ultimately creates the deal that you're going to close with your prospect. So, knowing this, why do so many deals stall? And regardless of whether you are in interest, intent, or commitment stage, when deals stall, it's usually down to qualification gaps in any one of those three phases. And to put it a different way, what is important about the opportunity that hasn't been clarified in the buyer's mind? Now, at each one of these phases, those qualification pieces will be totally different. At the educational interest phase, what the buyer is looking to understand and qualify, and what you need to qualify, will be completely different to the intent phase, to the commitment phase. If you ask some of those questions too early, you're going to get a blank look. If you ask them at the wrong time, the buyer is just not going to be ready to be able to answer them. And for me, the most common gaps include things like the problem just isn't important enough. They've got an idea of all the symptoms, but they haven't realized what the root cause of that issue is and how those issues are all interconnected in their business. Also, sometimes when I'm talking to prospects, they just do not have that connection to the strategic goal. The business impact just isn't clear enough. What I mean by this is that one stakeholder in the business is really passionate about this, and they understand the impact. They understand how important it is to solve this, but the rest of the business is not aligned with that way of thinking. They don't see the problem in the same way. And that's perhaps because the person who owns it actually is the wrong person. Other stakeholders need to own the problem just as much as that particular person as well. So that ultimately leads to a lack of stakeholder alignment, which means that deals are naturally going to stall, which means they're not going to get prioritized. And finally, as I said it before, the cost of change just feels too high. That emotional burden, the emotional energy that's going to have to be expanded in order to do this is just too much. And there perhaps are too many other projects going on in the business that the business just cannot give this the time, the attention, the care that it actually needs. Deals rarely stall at the end of the process. They always stall during qualification, right? And to combat this, I actually want to share a model with you, and I call it the deal momentum model. What the deal momentum model is that it really tries to explain how real buying momentum forms. And momentum typically increases when four forces align. And let me explain in a little bit more detail. Firstly, the problem that the customer has, the buyer has, becomes clearer in their mind. Through questioning, the better the sales questions that you ask, this is your goal as a salesperson. The clarity that you already have with regards to what your solution can achieve, your questions have to help your prospect, your buyer, actually understand that problem as clearly as possible. If they're able to articulate it in their own words and they have that same energy and passion to solving that problem, you've done a massive tick. You've created loads of momentum, not only for you, but for them internally within their organization. Secondly, the impact of solving the problem actually is totally understood, and the business as a whole starts to understand it. Generally speaking, the symptoms actually compound, and the impact across the business is massive. Once they understand that, actually, momentum increases tenfold. Thirdly, the more stakeholders that are involved across the business, the more momentum that you're going to have. The key thing here is that it's not about just having one stakeholder at one level. It's about multiple stakeholders at multiple levels. And of course, the more complex the deal, the more stakeholders that are going to be involved. The more simpler the deal, the less stakeholders are going to be involved. But what it also means is that perhaps 2 or 3 stakeholders who own or have the power within the business are wearing multiple hats. So it still means that you're going to have to tick all these boxes, but it just means that there's less stakeholders involved. And you're going to have to actually go through all of these different conversations with those same individuals. And the fourth part of that momentum model is actually the risk of change becomes manageable. What I mean by this is that the perceived risk of change actually isn't seen as a barrier. The emotional transformation, the emotional energy that's going to be needed to make this change is understood, and the business is still willing to move forward. These 4 elements are the deal momentum model, and they ultimately enable opportunities to move forward at pace. Now, when these forces kind of come together and they strengthen, deals are naturally going to move forward. And in my opinion, and in my experience, what I've seen is that the best salespeople create momentum. They create that energy using these 4 practical levers. They clarify the real business problem. The questioning helps them to uncover what the root cause is. But they don't just play that back to the client. Actually, the client, through that questioning, through that intelligent business building model, understands it and realizes for themselves that all these symptoms are perhaps interconnected and linked to a bigger issue. Secondly, the best salespeople actually connect that problem to the business impact, i.e. to a strategic initiative that the business has. Thirdly, they proactively expand the stakeholder conversation. They don't just go horizontally across the business at one level. They go vertically up the business as well. They go and find not just user stakeholders, but perhaps technical stakeholders, economic stakeholders, value stakeholders, and so on and so forth. So all the different kinds of buyers perhaps that are involved in that decision-making process, from a user, a manager, a department head, the economic stakeholder, perhaps a financial stakeholder. And finally, they reduce the perceived risk of change. They get rid of as much friction that might exist, right? And they acknowledge all of those perhaps doubts that the buyer has in terms of making this particular decision. For me, the best salespeople are exceptional, and they are adept at actually seeing the signals of when a deal is likely to stall. And they just have this mechanism to actually know when deals are going to move forward and deals are going to actually stall. So some of the early warning signals that they are looking out for are things like actually the buyer is unable to articulate the problem. It sounds really, really vague, and the buyer can't express it clearly enough. Right? The buyer doesn't actually understand how all of these different elements are interconnected. The buyer doesn't have something strategic, some form of business impact to connect the problem to. What often happens is an issue that where buyers at one level see the problem and they're really passionate about it, but actually senior folk within that business, senior buyers, senior stakeholders just don't see the problem in that same way. A great example of that is the CRM. Talk to most salespeople, they'll tell you their CRM system doesn't work, they don't like it, it's too much admin. But the more often you go higher in an organization, they will not see it in the same way. It's just there is a miscommunication, there's a mismanagement when it comes to how CRMs are maintained and managed. Often, other early warning signals, there is only one stakeholder or internal stakeholders are not aligned. They're all asking for different things, they're all seeing the problem in a different way, their measures of success are completely different. And often you'll also get lots and lots of activity, but nothing changes, right? And that just means that there is a disconnect. There is no agreement within the business in terms of how to move forward. And finally, what this ultimately impacts is timing. Rather than actually sticking to agreed objectives, decisions, and times, those timeframes just keep slipping. And that's simply because they do not see this as a priority and people are not willing to commit their time, their energy and effort to the particular problem. These, for me, are the early warning signals that the best salespeople just proactively pick up on, and they look out for these. And if they see them, they slow the conversation down and they actually adjust their questioning technique. So if you want to improve the quality of the opportunities that you have in your pipeline and you are adding to your pipeline consistently, then 3 things that you should focus on proactively. First and foremost, make sure that you truly understand your buyers, including their challenges, their objectives, their measures of success, who is involved in the process. The better the idea that you have of that unique buyer insight, the easier it's going to be for you to help them navigate that decision-making process. Secondly, you need to understand what that compelling reason to act is or was, right? What is the trigger? Because in my experience, it will be different for different clients across different industries. The key thing is it's understanding what it means for them and why that is important for your buyer, for your client. I've worked in organizations where a management change has been the trigger. I worked in other organizations where actually it's been some government regulation that's changed, that's been the trigger. And in other organizations, it's because there's been new investment coming in and the shareholders want to go in a different direction. The trigger is going to be unique by different clients. It's your responsibility as a salesperson to understand and uncover what that is through your questioning. And finally, you've got to have clarity on what their decision-making process is. How are they going to make that buying decision and what factors are important to them? The better you understand and perhaps do a backward timetable to know all the steps that they need to take, who's going to be involved, the easier it becomes for you to plan ahead and to determine actually when you're on track versus when things are actually slipping. And you use that proactively with your champion, your key stakeholder to ensure that you get back on track. I leave you with these 3 takeaways from today's session. Firstly, deals do not stall because buyers are difficult. They stall because the conditions for a confident decision have not been created by the salesperson. Secondly, remember, interest creates a conversation. Intent creates the opportunity, but commitment is ultimately what creates the deal. And finally, the role of the salesperson is not to push a deal forward. It is to always strengthen the conditions to allow the buyer to make a considered decision that is right for them. Because if it's right for the buyer, it will naturally be right for the salesperson and for the selling organizations. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something from today's session. And if you did, please don't forget to hit the subscribe, the follow, the connect, the like button, and we will always send you the next edition of the Sales Still Human Masterclass series so that you know exactly when it is. Thank you for listening and have a great rest of your day.